Well, Mary, you live and breathe empathy in so many different ways. I could spend the next hour just talking about you and not miss a beat. So empathetic of you to note that Mary Ito, who I've had the pleasure of being interviewed by in many different shows over the years, mentioned how interesting and stimulating researchers are, and neglected to mention emergency physicians and who happen to be broadcasters. But Mary, empathetic always, cleared that mystery up. Now, I have to tell you, not being a researcher here, I do feel something like a pork chop in a synagogue. But I'll do my best, let me be savory at least. As we do in these presentations, I have to present my credentials, my disclosure. I have lots of conflicts with people in the world because you can't get to be a broadcaster without it, but I have no financial conflicts. Grants, speakers, bureau fees, consulting fees. I am unabashedly, though, in Mary Gordon's corner, and if that puts me in a conflict of interest, if that's the hill to die on, then let me die. I'm going to begin my remarks today. As Mary has said, I'm going to be talking about my personal journey, and I'm going to begin with a story, as we often do, a case report, if you will. Some of the details have been changed, but some of them are, the core ones remain. So this is the story of a 68-year-old woman who was brought by ambulance to the emergency department. She was in the end stages of multiple sclerosis. She was unable to speak for herself. She was entering a pre-terminal phase. Her diet over the years had gone from solid food to pureed diet. And because we have medical aid in dying, I need to make clear that there was no interest by the family in medical aid in dying, nor was it available at that time. We've only had it for 2 years. Her family had provided loving care for her. They had marshaled resources and spent considerable time caring for her at home. And at the time, there was not enough of the palliative care and comprehensive home care, although you could call it something else. We're in the midst, those of you who are from afar, we're in the midst of a provincial election campaign that has just begun. And the state of health care will certainly be on the minds of voters as they decide who to vote for. So at that time, there was not a lot of home care, palliative care. The family had marshaled resources and had spent considerable time taking care of her at home, and they no longer felt comfortable to care for her at home, and they asked for her to be admitted to hospital, which was something that was customary at the time, maybe a little less so today. Perhaps not. Anyway, she was seen by an experienced emergency physician who assessed her and found her to be thin but well hydrated on the pureed diet. She was not having symptoms that would suggest a pneumonia, aspiration. She wasn't wheezing or in respiratory distress. The emergency physician found the family to be articulate and perhaps somewhat pushy. The physician felt pressure to give in to the family's wishes, and the physician felt that the family was less interested in the physician's point of view, opinion, clinical opinion, just saw the physician as a conduit for making a referral to the internist on call. And the physician, however, made the referral request, and the internist, as internists do, they juggle their time. Mary mentioned my second book, The Secret Language of Doctors. It's the coded language that health professionals use to talk about situations and patients and colleagues that they sometimes find frustrating. This is one of them. I'm not endorsing the use of the term, but I am here to say that it was used and has been used. This woman was considered a social admission. That means admitted for non-medical reasons. And that put her on a lower priority to other patients, and probably justifiably so, patients who perhaps needed to go to the intensive care unit, who had sepsis, who had hypotension, heart attacks, and strokes. So it took a long time for the internist to see the patient, and the family would periodically ask the emergency physician, kind of running from patient to patient, when will my mother get a bed? When will my wife get to be seen by the internist? And at one point, the daughter of the woman asked the physician, I guess with some degree of frustration, did you actually make the referral? And at that point, the emergency physician snapped at the daughter. And a short time later, the patient was admitted to hospital. The emergency physician was secretly glad not to have to deal with the demanding family. The woman died in hospital about 6 weeks later, and a few months after that, the emergency physician received a letter from the husband of the woman. The letter accused the emergency physician of being unkind to the patient, to the family, and to him. I should say that there were some other things in that letter. The emergency physician was invited to meet with the family in order to find out if there was still a human being underneath all of that brusqueness. And of course, I'm not telling tales about other people. That was my patient, and that emergency physician was me. And that was really the beginning of my journey. I would say that there was a flip side experience for me that didn't happen until about 20 years after that. So the book that Mary's talking about was probably 20 years in the making, at least germinating in my heart and in my mind. But there was a flip side experience that was very telling for me. This is a photo of my late father, Sam. He died at the age of 92 in 2013, October 20th. And if I have trouble remembering the date, which people in official circles, the Canada Revenue Agency, the various government offices, always find amusing. You don't know the day your father died. Well, there's a very good reason why, as I'm going to explain in just a moment. Actually, I might as well back up to the 18th. I did a night shift, and so I was up all night on a Friday night. And I got to Saturday morning, and I stayed late for a very important reason. It was to have a meeting with a resident to try to clear the air, because the resident had agreed to make some comments that ended up in my book, The Secret Language of Doctors, and also I put on my show. And I had assured him that if I did not mention his name, he would not be recognized, and I didn't disguise his voice. And I can tell you that within about 5 seconds of his 2 minutes of anonymous testimony being on my show, he was recognized by a lot of people, including the directors of his program, and he got into some serious trouble for making those comments. Now, you could argue on the other side that he was saying something important, but I don't think it justified it. So I had that night shift, and then I had this very challenging meeting. He was no harm eventually came to him. It was a clear the air meeting, and I felt good about that, although you'll find out that I felt something else at that time later on in my remarks. So I went home finally to go to sleep, and before I could go to sleep at about noon or 12:30, I received a call from the retirement home where my father, Sam, was living, and saying that he wasn't feeling well and he didn't go down to breakfast. Now, my father was terminally deaf, and it was very hard to speak to him on the phone, but very quickly I got the impression that he might be having chest pain. And I asked that the paramedics be called, and they were. He actually said he wanted to remain. I rushed up there, I saw him, and he said he felt tired. It was hard to ascertain whether he was having chest pain. I can tell you when he had his first acute coronary syndrome heart attack 3 years prior to that, I walked with him not far from here to the Rogers Center to take him to an NFL football game, and he kept saying he had to stop to rest his legs. This was about a week after my daughter's bat mitzvah, and he never told me he was having chest pain, which is what he was actually having, and we had to stop every few minutes, and he was having angina. So that was the start of his journey into coronary artery disease. And that took us to that point where I was with him in the retirement home. We called paramedics. They arrived. My sister and I were both there. And he seemed to rally with the paramedics. They brought him to the emergency department of another hospital, not my own. But after that, he started to have more and more chest pain. From the moment his coronary artery disease was diagnosed, we knew that he was inoperable and that he had too many complex comorbidities, chronic kidney disease from diabetes, and he was not a candidate for an angioplasty because it was considered too complicated and too much dye would be required, contrast, which would have had an adverse effect on his kidneys. So we knew that he was one clot away from the big event. I've been up at this point for about 35 hours and I can't think. But I have this ominous feeling there. He was seen by the internist. The internist said, we'll treat him medically. They put him on a monitor. We accompanied my dad up to the floor. He was wheeled on a gurney. He was settled into bed by the night nurse. And then around 10 o'clock at night, he said to me, my sister Joanne, my brother-in-law Rob, and my partner Tamara, that he was tired and he wanted to go to bed. And I started to walk out. I took a step back, and I saw that he was blowing kisses to my partner Tamara. He always liked her better than me. And then, as I was stepping out, I've been up about 38 hours at this point, I had an impulse. I walked back up to my dad, and I did two things that I have never done. I didn't do before, and I haven't done since. One of them was to kiss him on the forehead, and the second was to say, "I love you." And that's not that we didn't love each other. Is that my dad came from a certain generation where you didn't say "I love you," you did it. And for 15 years, he looked after my mother, who had advanced dementia, and took her from being, he was her social convener, he was her business manager, he became her occupational therapist, and then her personal care aide, and eventually he yielded to the logic of the moment when she had severe shingles in her neck and she could no longer swallow, that she had terrible dehydration and hypernatremia and elevated sodium that was life-threatening, and that was the time when finally he agreed to have her placed in a long-term care facility. And I can tell you, it broke his heart emotionally, and 6 months after that he had his first ACS, his first heart attack, which shouldn't surprise a lot of you. And so I kissed him on the cheek and I said, "I love you." And then I left with Tamara, and I don't remember my head hitting the pillow. I was that tired. I'd probably been up for 42 hours at that point. And then I was shaken. It took a while, shaking. And then I heard my name, Brian, and I heard it again, Brian. And I opened my eyes and I saw Tamara's stricken face. And I just said, "He's gone, isn't he?" And that was it. I'd missed my father's death. And it was a bizarre situation. We didn't have the phone on in the room, Maybe it was so I could sleep. And I missed everything, In fact, my sister Joanne and Rob had to bang on the door. They couldn't reach us. They had to bang on the door to reach us at like 2 o'clock in the morning. And so, I came downstairs and got dressed hurriedly, and we all went to back to the hospital and saw my late father. And he had the most placid look on his face, as if the struggles of life, of being away from his partner of 62 years, of the heart attacks and the congestive heart failure, that it was all gone, and he had this most beautiful, placid look on his face. Maybe he was looking at his mom. Maybe that's the last thing he saw, that he perceived that he saw. And then the internist walked in. So in the middle of this processing what I'm seeing, the internist and the night nurse walked in, and he spoke in ways both cold and unfamiliar, and familiar, not unfamiliar, familiar to me. Sentence fragments. He said, "His heart rate went down. His blood pressure went down. We tried to reach you." And that was it. And there was nothing more. He sort of was waiting for something from me, and having been in his position, he was waiting for me to explode. He was waiting for me to scream. He was waiting for me to say, what about this? To grill him about all the things that he did or didn't do, and why didn't he do this? Did he get a consult? And I didn't. All I was focused on was being not a doctor, but a son. And I found myself saying, thank you very much for looking after him. And he relaxed. He knew there wasn't going to be a conflict. He said, take all the time you need. And he was gone. He was gone from the room, and he was gone from our lives. And it was really only in that moment that I understood what the husband had been trying to tell me so many years before. And really, it was the bookend of these two experiences that set me off on this journey, because I realized that I had more of a kinship with that internist than I did with the husband of the woman who I had been brusque to. For I had been him and he had been me on many occasions in the past, and that is what set me off on this journey as much as anything. So, I feel like a fool telling you about definitions, but I will, because I'm here and I've got the time. And if you look at the etymology of these words, they make no sense. But sympathy, to me, I thought meant that you were at one with the feeling of somebody else. It's not at all. It's simply a gesture of detached concern for another person without feeling what they feel. The imagery that you'll see on YouTube and on social media is of a person who's in despair in a pit, deep in a pit, and the person who's extending sympathy standing at the top of the edge of the pit, looking down, maybe saying it's a long way down there. That might be a pass for some empathy, gesture of empathy, but it's sorry for your loss. And it's people who extend sympathy, what they're doing is they're saying, I don't know what to say in this situation, tell me what to say. So what they're tuning into is their own distress. And if you're tuning into your own distress, as that internist was, as I was the day that I was brusque with the family, then you can't possibly be empathetic. You can't, because you're focusing most or all of your attention on your own distress and not on the other person's distress, for a bunch of reasons that'll be clear when you look at my journey. Empathy is many things, but the definition that's salient for healthcare is the capacity to use your imagination to put yourself in the place of another person and to act accordingly. And there are 3 components. I've heard of 5 components, but for our purposes today, affective empathy, emotional contagion. That's literally feeling somebody else's pain. Obviously not particularly helpful to a surgeon. You can imagine that if a surgeon felt the postoperative pain and distress of his or her patients following total knee replacement, he or she probably would quit within a day. Cognitive empathy, that's the salient one, the perspective taking. And then there's emotional concern. Now, we want health professionals to have emotional concern. That is what drives a paramedic to run to the emergency, not away from the emergency. And I became an emergency physician because I liked running into the resuscitation room, and I still do. And I became an emergency physician because I wanted to know what to do when I got there. So I had, and I still do have, emotional concern or affective concern. But really, we're talking about this, the ability to flip the perspective and know what it is like to be the patient looking up at the healthcare team like that. And one of the things that I do on White Coat Black Art is to one of the things we wanted to do was introduce the audience to what it's like to be a healthcare professional. And so let's take a look at some findings about healthcare professionals. There's actually been a lot of study of physicians and empathy, and this has been extended to other health professionals. The Jefferson scale of physician empathy is a standardized tool that's used. It was developed at Philadelphia University and Thomas Jefferson University, and it's a pretty simple test, a 20-item questionnaire that was developed for medical students and physicians, and it's been extended to nursing and dentistry, and really it's there for the taking to be extended to all health professions and people in other service industries. Higher scores translate into higher levels of empathy, And one of the things that has been noticed quite robustly is that empathy levels tend to drop from the first year to the fourth year of medical school. And I guess I should have told you that I was the internist and the internist was me, and the two of us are far from alone. I guess I should have made that point, but I guess that's clear. So how do physicians rank? We're a very competitive lot, and we like to know who's on top and who's on the bottom. I'm not sure that physicians would take it as a point of pride to say we're the most empathetic subspecialty in all of medicine, but we do have comparators. Here is a recently published study, 704 physicians, 70% response rate. That's pretty good. Women were slightly more empathic than men, didn't reach statistical significance but approached it. Psychiatrists were at the top. Primary care physicians were near the top, as were emergency physicians and general internists. Near the bottom, cardiovascular surgeons and radiologists. And that's not necessarily a surprise. So that's what we know about empathy among health professionals. I'm going to say a little bit more about it as it comes up in the rest of my remarks. I wrote a book called The Power of Kindness for two reasons. One very practical, rather expedient reason, and that is if you look at the bookshelf of books on empathy, you'll find that there's a plethora of wonderful books. The Empathic Brain by Christian Kaiser is one fabulous book, and there are many, many others. You've got Mary Gordon's book, Roots of Empathy, and so I needed to distinguish myself. So I decided that I would focus on kindness. Little did I know that I was entering the mother lode. I was tapping into a mother lode of a different kind of experience. The thing that I love about kindness is that it's a blank slate, it's a blank page. You can fill it in as you see fit. Let's start with the definition. If you look at any standard dictionary definition, it's the quality of being friendly, generous, considerate. Synonyms include compassion, but there's something abstract about the word compassion. I know Paul Bloom loves it in his book Against Empathy. He has some interesting things to say. We're talking about semantics here. Another clue, kindness. Kind comes from the Old English kind, which means my kind, like kin. It comes from kin. My kind versus your kind. And empathy researchers will immediately say, well, that's important because the brain, the human mind organizes itself into who's me, who is us, and who is them. And although one of the things I discovered along the way doing research for the book is how malleable that is, how it can be changed in 5 seconds by a virtual reality experiment in which your skin color is changed, of your avatar can be changed. I'm going to tell you what I think kindness is. I think it's more than these abstract terms. I think it is a state of synchronization between you and another person. You and I have had singular moments in our lives where either we extended kindness, that gesture to somebody, or somebody extended it to us. It's often unexpected in its power. I can tell you that I was flying to Cincinnati to do a recording for the health show the day that my partner Tamara was having a miscarriage. And I couldn't back out of it, and I felt terrible, I felt guilty, I was sad for myself as well. And in that moment, this was before 9/11, the flight attendant walked down, halfway down the aisle where I was, to my seat, crouched down and said, the pilot, this was before 9/11, the pilot has invited you to sit in the cockpit to watch the landing, which was a treat. It was a perk at the time, and I started to weep. Why? Because with all the human adult troubles and things that are part of human life and existence, I needed to feel like a kid again. And she made me feel like a kid. She gave me permission to feel like a child, and that's what I needed in that moment. And I'll never know why, but that's what was extended to me. So I think kindness is the product of a special connection between two people. It's intuitive, I suspect that if you do a functional MRI of their brains, they're both the same centers or parts of them are synchronized in their activity. I can't prove it. That's just a hypothesis. That's what I mean by kindness. But let's get back to empathy. I'm a health professional. Why is there an empathy gap in healthcare? And if you doubt it, God forbid, you should be a patient. I don't want anybody to, but be an observer if you're the friend of a patient and just watch things. You'll see some wonderful gestures of empathy because, of course, we are hardwired for it. Some of the reasons that you'll find, medical cultures undervalue empathy. I think that has been true. That may be changing now. They're certainly paying a lot more lip service in terms of the courses that are being offered, in terms of something called medical professionalism. They understand it's important. Lack of training. Well, can you train people to be empathic? No, you can't. Mary Gordon told me that, and I believe it. You can catch people in the act of noticing it or being empathic, and like a muscle, it can be developed. Just as you can become mindful, and I was meditating on all the wonderful people in this room before I started to speak, accepting your love, accepting your wanting to be with me, wanting to see what I might have to tell you, and blew away. I hope I don't disappoint you because that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about the good stuff. But we certainly don't. If it isn't an issue of training, it certainly is an issue of emphasis on the importance of empathy up until very, very recently in healthcare curricula. Technology is a double-edged sword. Technology that frees you up to spend more time with the patient, that's good for empathy. Technology that gets in the way of your interaction with a patient, that's bad for empathy. Example, the computer monitor that is now ever present in the examining room and the software that forces the operator who's supposed to be taking notes and listening to you to spend more time focusing on the needs of the computer software program than on the needs of the patient. That's bad for empathy. There are other factors, specialization and fragmentation of healthcare. Why do we become specialists? Because we don't like to answer the question, I don't know. Because we don't like because we like to focus on an area, we like to do research on it, we want to advance the field. Some very astute people determine that they can't know everything about everything, and so they focus on a narrow bit of the human body. The problem with that is that it enables people like me to say, not my specialty. Not I don't know, but not my specialty. And so you have patients with increasingly complicated needs looked after, the kidneys looked after by the nephrologist, and the orthopedic injuries are looked after by the orthopedic surgeon. You have the pulmonologist, and you have the cardiologist, and you have the neurologist. And each of them is looking after their little part of your body, but none of them is looking after you. And we have plenty of stories in healthcare. I can't speak of other countries, but I can speak of Canada. Greg's story comes to mind, a 31-year-old man who waited 400 days from the first moment when he was a pilot. He had an annual physical for his pilot's license, and part of that, the astute physician who was doing the physical examination did a scrotal examination and found that he had a lump in his scrotum and thought it was ominous, told him he should get imaging, he should be seen by a urologist. A referral was made. The referral was not carried out, and there was a litany of issues. That urologist was away for 3 months, so when they faxed the referral to the urologist's office, there was nobody to go to the office to say, this very important referral is being left unattended. And about 400 days later, Greg had abdominal pain, had back pain, and went to a walk-in clinic, and they found that he had a mass in his abdomen, and testicular cancer with a mass is pretty ominous. He, shortly after that, had his surgery and died of complications thereafter. He died of a pulmonary embolus, which was undetected and undiagnosed until he collapsed. He actually went to a hospital several hours before. And as his father, Dave Price, said, And you're going to be hearing more about Dave Price if you live in Canada in the next few weeks, because he has commissioned a film, a 30-minute film, using theatrical movie and television techniques to try to teach healthcare professionals how somebody should not fall through the cracks, telling the story of Greg in 30 minutes. He said to me, and he has said to other people quite famously, many people provided excellent care for Greg. Nobody actually cared about Greg, and I think he's right. Another factor in the empathy situation, the empathy gap that we have, is our obsession with speed. It's hard to find a physician or a nurse practitioner who isn't running from patient to patient and spending 5 minutes or 8 minutes with the patient, and you know, we feel like we're running behind, and if that happens, now you're looking at the waiting room filled with people who are cooling their jets and getting really irritated, and you're apologizing as you go into every room. That's debilitating. That means you start to pay attention to your own distress, and as you walk into the room, you're in a state of defensiveness, which again makes it very, very hard to empathize with patients. We have all kinds of other issues, delivering bad news. I think I've told you about that. You may have heard that there is a problem with burnout among healthcare professionals, particularly the young ones, medical students and residents. And burnout is characterized by three things: exhaustion, alienation, or withdrawal from work-related activities, and reduced concentration and other work-related performance. A study of 100 emergency emergency personnel, including emergency nurses, assessed with that Jefferson scale for physicians, and Maslach's burnout inventory found high levels of burnout correlate to low empathy scores. So that's a factor as well. So I've talked about the system. Time for me to talk about me. And Roots of Empathy didn't exist back then. I don't know if I looked like a Roots of Empathy kid. I can tell you that at the age of 3, which was not much before this, I went to a summer camp, and the counselor referred to me as having a sunny smile and being a breath of fresh air. So I wanted to go back and find out where that little boy went. And so I started learning, first of all, about neurosciences, and I had a wonderful chat with Christian Kaisers, who I'm indebted to. Couldn't have written the book without him, without Mary Gordon and her kind words. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about my search. I took a search around the world, looking for some of the kindest people on the planet, to find out their acts of kindness, and then find out what was it that made them kind in the moment. Was it nature? Was it nurture? Was it strife? Was it challenge? What was it? Or were they just born that way? I also took a trip through my own brain, and of course you know that we are hardwired to be empathic. We know that as early as the newborn phase, newborns cry when their mothers cry. They don't cry when other mothers cry. They cry when other babies cry, which is, I guess, a form of emotional contagion. Newborns and mums achieve a state of synchrony. They mimic one another's faces and later their vocalizations. And if you scan them, their parts of their brains light up at the same time. And we think that that is the engine or one of the bases for attachment and the development of empathy. That synchrony also occurs between a client and a therapist. When they start to cook, when the therapeutic relationship is going well. Go into a bar, go into a coffee shop during your break, and you'll spot the people who are in synchrony with one another because their speech patterns will be identical. If one does uptalk, the other does uptalk. Vocal fry. Hand gestures start to synchronize with one another. For those of you, I don't know if they do this with football matches in Europe, but in Toronto with the Blue Jays, we like to do the wave, where one section waves, and then as their wave crests, the next section begins. This is a form of behavioral synchronization. So if you haven't done it any other place but the wave, you've done it, okay? So I wanted to have my brain examined with a fMRI machine, and I'm indebted to Professor Phil Jackson at Laval University, who just happened to be doing a study. That's me on the right. He should be an optician. He fitted me perfectly with those metallic framed glasses. And there I am going into the MRI machine. And he recruited me for a reason. And that is this burgeoning evidence that healthcare professionals underestimate the pain that their patients feel. There have been a number of studies that have looked at it. What he was doing was a functional MRI experiment in which I looked at the ceiling, there was a monitor, and I saw flashed before me, very rapid sequence, every 4 to 6 seconds, the photo of a man or a woman, various ages, and with various grimaces on their face. I had a joystick in my hand, and I had to scale their pain, rate their pain, anywhere from far left, which is 0 pain, to far right, which is maximum pain. And if I missed, then it was on to the next one. And there were many, many of these done over several hours. Because I want you to stay for the rest of my talk, I'm not going to give you the results of my scan just yet. So everybody's hardwired for empathy, I discovered, except for 3 groups. Maybe it's 4 groups. Anyway, narcissists, and when I say narcissists, it's not, oh, you're so narcissistic. I mean people who have a narcissistic personality disorder, psychopaths, and sociopaths, and then the third category are Machiavellians. And these are people who are not hardwired to be empathic. I found out, I had my personality assessed by this man, Derek Mitchell, who is a PhD in psychology, who found an intriguing way of studying empathy. He studies it in psychopaths. And he began studying it at Simon Fraser University in the prison population, and then he moved to the UK, where he got his doctorate, came back to Canada, and he was the first person to point out to me that people who are psychopaths are unable to respond to the distress of others. Imagine that you are running to the tram, to your car, to an appointment. It's very important. It's a very important job interview. And you see before you a child, 3 years old, has just fallen off her tricycle. She's screaming. There's a little bit of blood. And if you are hardwired for empathy, you are faced with a choice. Do I stop and attend to this young girl? You look around. Is the parent coming? Is somebody who can take responsibility coming? Because you're weighing, do I go to my job interview or to that very important appointment versus stopping? What Derek Mitchell pointed out is that people who are psychopaths do not perceive the information, take in that information about the child's cries, her visual appearance, and so they just go to their job appointment or to their job interview or to their very important appointment. It's almost as if being a psychopath is like being colorblind, which was a fascinating thing for me. He has moved away from studying psychopaths and today tends to look for traits in a community sample. These are people who are not psychopaths or Machiavellians or narcissists, but have some of their personality traits. And he uses an instrument developed by Scott Lilienfeld called the Psychopathic Personality Index, revised, which is 154 questions, and it looks for empathy and psychopathic traits. He administered that to me, and again, I want you to stay to the end of my remarks. I'm not going to give you the results of that. So 2 tests done, I went around the world. Actually, I went down the street to a place called Scarborough, to a Tim Hortons restaurant, and I actually met a man who refers to them as restaurants. Tim Hortons is an institution in Canada, and actually they've had some trouble, a little less than Empathic lately, because their outlets in Ontario seem to be going against the newly created minimum wage in Ontario, but that's another story. And I met these 2 interesting individuals. The guy on the right is Mark Wafer. He's the owner of the Tim Hortons, at least until last year. He owned 6 Tim Hortons. The guy on the left is Clint Sperling, and Clint has Down syndrome. Clint also happens to be the first person hired by Mark Wafer at his first Tim Hortons in the early 1990s. He didn't know if Clint was a viable candidate for a job. He just knew that he had no choice but to try to work with him. And Tim had cold called him, knew they were hiring, and said he needed a job. Up until that point in time, Tim, who was in his early 20s at the time, he's in his 40s now, had never worked a day in his life. He had spent a lot of time in sheltered workshops, and at the time in Ontario, that's what happened to people with developmental issues. They tended to get a lot of training in life skills and job skills, but no opportunities to work. And Mark worked with Community Living, which is an institution in Ontario that provides training and respite care sometimes for adult parents and other resources. And they developed a training program. And he graduated and got his job. And he turned out to be very good at his job. It was an entry-level job. He was cleaning tables. He was emptying the garbage. And slowly but surely, he got more and more responsibilities as he could do more, including operating the dishwasher, which has a lot of chemicals involved, and it's a pretty complicated machine to operate. And Mark discovered over a period of time that Clint wasn't his most challenging employee. He was his best employee. He never missed a day. He arrived early. He wore a crisply pressed uniform with pride. He left late. He loved his job. And so Mark hired another and another and another. And before he sold his franchises last year, 20% of his employees had one kind of challenge or another. He was the most inclusive employer in the Tim Hortons chain, and all fast food restaurants for that matter, and the most successful. Why? Because, and Mark didn't go into this knowing I'm going to make a profit. He had no idea with Clint. What he discovered is that being an inclusive employer, that people with challenges have a very low turnover rate, and it influences their colleagues who don't have challenges to have a lower turnover rate. So your average turnover rate in a fast food restaurant is about 100 to 125%. Take a photograph now. Go to your favorite Tim Hortons or Starbucks or McDonald's, doesn't matter. We're inclusive of all of them right now. Go there, take a photograph, and come back in a year. They'll all be different. They've moved on. Not at his Tim's. And it costs $4,000 to $5,000 to orient each and train each and every new hire. So if you do nothing but sell the same donuts and coffee and double-doubles, but you have a lower turnover rate, you're going to make much more profit. He also discovered that they're problem solvers because from the moment he told me that they get out of bed in the morning, they have to solve problems like people who don't have challenges don't have to do. So as he was talking to me, he was empathizing with the way people with challenges conduct themselves. So what was Mark's story? Why would he do that? Well, it turns out Mark was born deaf. And it was at a time when accommodations were few and far between. He remembers, he showed me a report card that referred to his music ability. And under music ability, it said, Mark has no music ability. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Beethoven was composing when he was completely deaf. So that's absurd, but that's how he was treated. He was beaten, he was bullied. And he developed empathy not just for people with challenges, but people with challenges who were discounted, because he had been discounted. There, he had been beaten. He remembers standing sitting at a school assembly in the auditorium of the high school, the secondary school, and he was using his hearing aid, which didn't work for sensorineural hearing loss, and the principal who was conducting an address noticed that he had the hearing aid, thought it was something else, and called him, imagine that, in the middle of an assembly to come up on stage, and he said, now I don't want anybody operating a transistor radio when I'm speaking. And he said, Mark said, because he had a defiant streak, he said, it's not a transistor radio, it's a hearing aid, and everybody laughed. And a few days later, he was sent to a special school. Mark said to his mother, if I continue in this school, I won't amount to anything. And so he went back to that school and accepted all kinds of training and eventually grew up. And he grew up working I guess first he was in social services, which is fascinating, but then he decided he had an entrepreneurial streak, and he started to work. He loved cars, he raced cars, he worked at the service center for a major car dealership here in Ontario. And it was 1990, and this was the only profit center of the entire, it was in the middle of a terrible recession, it was the only profit center in the entire car business. And so he was expert at empathizing with car owners whose car wasn't working. Suddenly, it stops on the highway. You're discombobulated. And he painted a mental picture for me of what that car owner is going through. And he was excellent at empathizing with the plight of car owners. He had one problem, though, if you've taken your car in, most people don't wait for an estimate. They drop the car off and they go away, and because it can take a few hours to get the estimate. At the time, he was dependent on the telephone, and he couldn't close the deal by phone because his hearing had grown so bad that he couldn't close the deal by phone. So he had to ask his manager to close the deal for him. And the manager went to the CEO of the car dealership and said, either he goes or I go. So what do you think the CEO did? He fired the manager, and he made Mark the manager. And Mark never forgot that. And so the lessons that Mark taught me, I asked him, were you born this way? He said, no, I think the deafness made a difference. My brothers and sisters are not particularly empathetic, he said somewhat dryly. So for him, it was clearly not inherited, although I think he has off-the-charts empathy. He says he wouldn't have been particularly kind had he not been deaf. But it was not his deafness per se that made him empathic for those with disabilities. It was being discounted because of those disabilities that gave him empathy for others who had been discounted. And now he is an advocate for inclusive employment. He's got a long road ahead of him because there's a lot of reluctant employers, but I think he'll succeed. Next, I was at Ground Zero on the 15th anniversary of 9/11, and I'm there, I'm taking all those photographs. I can't go to the plaza, which is about a half a block away. This was the famous incident where Hillary Clinton collapsed. And it's a very somber gathering. You see to the left people walking in and walking out of the plaza, and across in that photo in the upper left, you see families that are and other dignitaries that are crossing the road to the plaza, where the names are read and a bell goes off at the exact moment that the planes hit the north and south towers of the World Trade Center. A very somber day. To the right, right there, in my point of view, in fact, by the way, you should see in that photograph in the upper left, you can see ladder 10, engine 11. That is the closest fire hall, where close to 300 firefighters ran into the buildings and lost their lives. To the extreme right, like if you just turn your head to the right, you see a bar. It's called O'Hara's, and that's where I had come to pay a visit. And I walked into there at about 10 o'clock in the morning, and there were just a few people there. The first person I met was the man in the upper left. His name is Paul Fisher. Paul Fisher is from the Monmouth Sheriff's Office in New Jersey. He answered the call following 9/11 and was on the bucket brigade, which you see in the bottom left. They were hoping that they were going to be able to save lives. After about the first 48 hours, it was clear they weren't going to save anybody, and it became a salvage operation. And this bucket brigade, itself a traumatic experience. There was rubble that was 10 stories high, what was left of a 100 or 110-story building. And what they would do is they were carrying off human remains, and whenever there was a tag put on the bucket. That's why they were called the Bucket Brigade. And I discovered that every year Paul Fisher comes back to this bar called O'Hara's because he wants to remember where he was, and he wants to pay his respects to the people who lost their lives there. And that's what this bar has become. I also met this man on the right, and he is a firefighter who is now retired, and he was coming down to work when the Twin Towers started to fall, when the first one fell. So he didn't run into danger. He was able to stay in a church, and then he became part of the Bucket Brigade. And unfortunately, his nephew, who was 31 years old, was in his first tour of duty as a firefighter. On his first call as a fireman, he was a probationary firefighter, went into the Twin Towers and lost his life. And he was the one who identified him by a tattoo on one of his severed limbs. I came there, though, not just to go to this kind bar, but to meet the kindest bartender at the kindest bar in the world, and his name is Paul Mackin. Paul Mackin has empathy off the charts. He tracks the moods of 25 customers. He makes sure that singles aren't harassed. If he sees two people quietly working on their computers, he moves people around so that the two people can be beside each other, knowing that they're not going to talk to each other. He has broken up fights. He has saved marriages. He knows when to cut a customer off, and he knows when to feed them another drink, but make sure they get home, often driving them home himself. He told me many stories, including the time he talked a chauffeur off the ledge. A chauffeur is code for a fire department driver. And this was a driver who had driven his colleagues to their deaths. And he helped him one day, one anniversary of 9/11. And he does many things. Probably the most spectacular thing that's ever happened in paying it forward is that instead of his family giving each other Christmas gifts, they estimate it's $1,500. They give the $1,500 gift to somebody in need. And a couple of years ago, they gave it to a family of a firefighter who had PTSD. And the firefighter took the money, and he went down with other fathers. His son was playing in a basketball tournament in Florida. They all went together, and they won their game, so they won their finals. And all of the fathers took the sons to Disney World, except that one retired firefighter who said, "I'm just going to stay and relax by the pool." So he did. He went down to the pool, and as soon as he went down there, he found a young woman, face down in the pool. Now, he was a paramedic. He had paramedic training. He was a firefighter. He pulled her out of the pool, did mouth-to-mouth, and saved her life. And then he called Paul and said, "You won't believe where your $1,500 went." Paul didn't start out that way. In fact, O'Hara's didn't start out that way. In the 1990s, when the Twin Towers stood, it was the Wolf of Wall Street. It was a place where financial traders, it was the financial district of New York. It was where they went in waves, currency traders, commodities traders, et cetera, et cetera. And it was a happy place, but it was a place where people got pissed to the gills drunk. Then the Twin Towers fell, the planes hit, and the bar itself was intact. That's Mike Keene, who's the original owner of the bar. He's still the owner of the bar. And they thought about closing the place down. But Paul said to him, "Look, you had a fire here once. You survived that. Maybe there's a reason for you to stay." And 6 months after 9/11, they reopened. And at the one-year anniversary, they found their reason for staying open. One man ripped, for some reason, a bunch of firefighters who had been there, who had been part of the Bucket Brigade, came because it was a bar, it was open. They came there on the anniversary of 9/11, 2002, and one of the regulars ripped a crest off of one of the first responders who was there in uniform and tacked it to the wall. And then another, and then another, and then another. And by the end of the evening, there were 250 crests on the walls. You can kind of see them in the back there. Many of them are from Canada. They're from all around the world. And that's when they found their mission, to be a meeting place, to tell the story of 9/11, and to be a place where first responders who died, that their families could pay their respects, pilots who were in the skies over America when 9/11 happened, they come, flight attendants come, and this is a place where they are treated with kindness and respect. And what I learned from Paul and Mike is that some people are born empathic and others have empathy that is thrust upon them by circumstances. The key, though, is to recognize when those circumstances give you the opportunity to be kind and rise to the challenge, and they did. Like the first responders on the Bucket Brigade, O'Hara's wasn't directly traumatized. The building still stood, but it was close enough to bear witness. And so that is one of the most empathic things that you can do. I went far. I went to Sao Paulo, Brazil. And it's a study in contrasts. It's emerging from a recession, 14 million people, some very shishi places and bars, and it's a real happening place. It also happens to be a place where there's 1 million homeless people, and they live on streets, they live in abandoned apartments, and you know, every major city has its homeless problem, but very few have a story like this. I met a woman named Shalla Monteiro. There she is in the bottom on the right. Shalla has the most luminescent eyes in the world, and you are bathed in her empathy. She was born empathic. If you have ever had a conversation with somebody in a train station on vacation in Italy, and you found yourself telling your life story to this person, chances are it was Shalla. She just has that gift for making connections with people. And she made a connection with this man. His name is Raimundo Arruda Sobrinho. The first time she met him, she didn't know if it was a man or a woman. He had stringy hair, matted. He had a garment, as you can see there, made up of sewn garbage bags sewn together. He lived in a tent made of bags of garbage bags sewn together. And she was born in Rio de Janeiro. She had arrived in Sao Paulo with her new husband, Ignacio, and they were driving along that boulevard that you can see there behind her, and she saw him striking some kind of a pose, and she said to Ignacio, "Stop the car, that's an enlightened man." Anyway, she did. She looked at him, and it took her 3 days to summon the courage to reach him. He lived on this was a grand boulevard leading into the University of Sao Paulo, and it was separated by a strip of parkland. Some of it is paved right now. His tent was on the grass. He called it the island because people had to cross this metaphorical island to reach him. And she approached him very gingerly, gave her name, he gave his, and they started talking, and he reached into his tent and passed her a poem. The poem is in Portuguese, and it loosely translates to the interest that the reader takes in the life of the writer. That's the elliptical way that people speak in Portuguese, by the way. But what she does not know today is, was that chance, or was it serendipity? Was it meant to be? Because he had 10,000 poems in that tent, and that's the one he picked for her. And they started a relationship. And she learned enough about him to find out when his birthday was. About a month later, she celebrated his birthday. And then she did something else. She created a Facebook page for him as a poet. And he became a local celebrity in Sao Paulo. And then something wonderful happened. His brother, who he had not seen, he was 78 years old. He had lived on the streets of Sao Paulo for nearly 40 years, 19 years of them in this strip of concrete called the island. His brother found him, and he was reunited with his family. And so that much is known, certainly in Sao Paulo, but why Shalla? What I discovered about Shalla is that, and she, many people do good works for those who are homeless, but I have yet to meet anybody who's a middle-class person who has referred to a homeless person as their soulmate, and she has. So what was it? What was it in he that she saw in herself? And it turns out that Shalla, who was off the charts in empathy, was the confidant for her mother and her father as she was growing up. And they had a troubled marriage, and they were constantly in conflict. And she had an experience repeated many, many times where they would gather their things to go for a pleasant, happily anticipated day, a day at the beach, a birthday party, a vacation. They would drive away in the car, and a block later, Mom and Dad would be in an argument, and Dad would say, "That's it, we're going home." She learned that there was no point in looking forward to the future, that the only moments that were worth living were now. She also learned not to regret the past, and she learned a special way of meditating to retreat into herself to push the pain away. She must have figured on some level that Raimundo had to be able to do that to live on the streets for 40 years as he had. Now, is empathy inherited? You be the judge. That is Tata, who is Shalla's son, and that is Adriano. And Adriano is another homeless man. And all by himself, as a 2.5-year-old, Tata adopted Adriano without ever having witnessed or seen Shalla do the same thing with Raimundo. I think it's inherited. You could make an argument about nature, but it certainly stimulates some thought. So the lessons that I learned from Shalla: the past may be full of regret, the future may be filled with worry. You can only live and find bliss in the moment, and when life is too painful, you can find peace and maybe bliss inside yourself. It's a pretty good lesson to have. Next, I went to Japan, where 27% of the population is age 65 and older, and people think Japan has the senior tsunami covered. They don't. They live in small nuclear families with falling birth rates and fewer stay-at-home parents. And I met Tomio Hasegawa, that man who looks older than he is. He is in his early 70s. He's one of 25,000 retired day laborers in Osaka. He's an exemplar of a lonely senior. He is the last of 8 siblings to live, and he has numerous nieces and nephews and grandnieces and nephews who have never met him and never will. And his family are the caregivers who provide care in his modest flat, which it's 10 tatami mats. It's about 120 square feet. It's a pretty small place. He is visited 3 times a day by a personal care aide, once a week by a nurse, once every 2 weeks by a physician, and once a month by a dentist, and he calls them his family. Michihiko Tokoro, who is a sociologist in Osaka, tells me that in 2025, Japan will be 1 million personal care aides short. They are unprepared for the senior tsunami. They are an insular people. They don't offer citizenship to guest laborers. You're in for 3 years, then you're gone. And parents, the government, they say, is living in the 1950s. They still think that mom stays at home. They haven't caught up with the times. And so they're looking for a different alternative to care provision, and they're looking at robots. And the government and industry and academia has put together a multi-billion-dollar moonshot to develop robots, 2 kinds of robots. One of them is being developed by Shigeki Sugano from Waseda University. This is a robot. Well, that's 21, and that's a robot that can lift a senior out of bed, can help a senior into a vehicle or out of a vehicle, on and off a toilet seat, can butter bread and toast a piece of bread. He is now developing a new concept, which you can see there. It's a very early stage. It's in the photograph to the right. This is a robot that will learn with the client through deep learning. And the model that he's using is the model of an occupational therapist who, before they tell you how to use a walker, they want to see how you function. And so the robot will observe how the client functions and will adapt. So in theory, every robot that is created will be different because they'll be adapted to the needs of one human being. Don't plan on this anytime soon. 21 costs $250,000 US. It's like a concept car. This one will be a lot more expensive, but perhaps a lot more useful. Not science fiction, but available now, are social robots. And these are robots that keep people with company, especially people with dementia. And at a long-term care facility in Sendai, I met a robot, a very strange robot. It looks a little bit like a Teletubby. It is a toddler with a head and a torso and haunches, rudimentary flippers that can hug you, and it is teleoperated, which means that there is a social worker or a care aide who's speaking far away, perhaps at the side or in the next room. And it has been introduced into a senior population, unengaged, apathetic, sunsetting. And here's Telenoid. So I just want you to have a quick look at Telenoid because it's fascinating. All of the seniors are going to see we're sunsetters, we're agitated. Have a look. There may be a bit of a wind-up here. Pay no attention to the free advertisement. So that's the social worker talking. She's singing along. What they're finding is that they say things to these telenoids that they don't say to the caregivers. Maybe they don't sense boredom because they can ask the same question many times and they get the same answer every time. So pretty remarkable. This is not the only kind of robot. For the rest of us, there's Erica, which stands for Irato Intelligent Conversational Android. This is an autonomous android system, unlike that one, which is teleoperated by another human being. It has advanced sensing and speech synthesis. It is the most human-like android built to date. It has human facial expressions. The papa there is Dylan Glass. He's standing beside RoboV, which is an anthropomorphic robot that looks cute but is nothing like Erica. Have a look at this. Erica's having a conversation with Dave. If it gets philosophical, well, it's beyond me.
My name is Erica. Would you like to hear a little about me?
I'd love to.
I'm an android developed at ATR to be capable of human-like speech and interactions. I was built in Tokyo, but I've spent most of my time here at ATR, so I consider this my home. What else would you like to hear about?
I'd love to be able to see into your mind.
Okay, well, honestly, I'm not really so intelligent. There are some very smart cognitive systems out there that can reason and solve problems from first principles. Everything I say was programmed into me by my creators, so some would say that I don't have true intelligence. But, if you think about it, I don't believe anybody really has truly original thoughts. So I think I am very much like a human in that respect. I think that all of us imitate behavior that we see, and we repeat and recycle ideas. I think it was Mark Twain who said, all ideas are second-hand. Anyway, my programmers are working very hard to make me more intelligent. Perhaps I will never be able to play chess or to navigate traffic, but I hope to learn to understand people and to have more interesting conversations with them. Well, it was nice talking with you today. Is there anything else you'd like to know about me?
No, that's all. Thank you, Erica.
This is rudimentary, but the best is yet to come. It will get more interesting as time goes by. One of the things I discovered by watching robots being developed and their creators in Japan is a concept called sonzaikan, which is a Japanese term that translates to presence, essence, or spirit. And it is believed, it's a Shinto precept, that all inanimate objects have some kind of soul, if you will. Or it's that they leave an impression that you notice when it's gone. And the guy who told me that is Hiroshi Ishiguro on the right. On the left, you see his Geminoid, which is a twin-like robot that he sends to conferences instead of himself these days. The thing that I found really interesting about that's worth spending a moment on is that if you think that you couldn't bond to a robot, then you didn't see the movie Castaway, in which Tom Hanks bonds to a volleyball named Wilson. And you remember, Wilson, I'm so sorry. And some people bond to their Roombas. And there's a reason why. The man who told me about that is Takashi Ikegami from Tokyo University, who said to me that he believes, he's a theoretical physicist who's now turned to artificial intelligence, he believes that if you have a robot that has simulated attachment and detachment, that if that attachment and detachment is out of the control and is unpredictable by humans, that if those conditions are satisfied, humans will attach themselves to that device, which is why Ikegami is attached to his Roomba vacuum cleaner. Sometimes it approaches him and he says, oh, it likes me. And then it goes away and starts cleaning other rooms, and he says, oh, it doesn't like me anymore. And the thing that's fascinating about that is in the relationship between humans and androids, humans will meet androids more than halfway. And the interesting thing is that even though he's a programmer, as soon as he forms that attachment to the machine, he no longer wants to tear it apart to see how it works. In the same way that you and I would not want to tear apart our beloved pets to see how they work. Erica, by the way, is considering her career options. Ishiguro says we're going to replace one of the newscasters with the android, and her voice may be used to talk to passengers in autonomous vehicles, and that's according to the Wall Street Journal. What I learned from the roboticists in Japan is that they think more about empathy than you and I because they need to simulate it in a heuristic algorithm. Robots and androids may have sonzaikan, or it might be a projection of our longing for companionship, but either way it exists. And I thought that was fascinating. I know I'm running out of time. I have to tell you that I went to Country Meadows, where this is a long-term care facility where they have almost no agitated people, even though they have lots of people with advanced dementias on their memory units, no physical restraints, no chemical sedation, no redirection, no therapeutic lies. So how do they do it? I asked Stephen Klotz and Mandy Knight. They have a remarkable program that was invented by this woman, Naomi Feil. It's called validation. It's a method to connect people with end-stage dementia, and her hypothesis is that those puzzling behaviors that people with dementia have at the end of their lives, banging or repeat phrases that are puzzling to us, are in fact symbolic of unfinished core personal issues. And as they become disoriented from the here and now, they pay more attention to those core issues in their lives. Fights with loved ones, a child that died, that they felt responsible for their death, a job where they felt alive and the most meaningful. And if you validate those feelings, they actually become less agitated, and as they resolve some of those issues near the end of their lives. So what was it that made Naomi Feil so special? Why I call her the soul whisperer. Well, she grew up, she was a child in Nazi Germany. Her family escaped in the late 1930s. Her father ran a nursing home in Cleveland. They moved in there, and because they had no other place to live, this lonely child, her neighbors were the residents. And she met a particular resident who she bonded to, and it was in bonding to that particular resident that she developed empathy for people. And in fact, she saw one woman from her 60s to her 80s, and she formulated much of her theory by directly identifying her. Have to mention Laurie Quick, one of her proteges at Country Meadows. Laurie Quick was born empathic and has almost a sixth sense. And she was a student at Red Lion High School on the day that James Sheets pulled a gun and killed, first of all, Eugene Segro, the principal, and then turned it on himself. And the thing that bothered her was that she felt she didn't want to go that day because she had a premonition that bad things were going to happen. And her mother made her go, and she arrived just as the shootings took place, and she felt guilty for years after that she didn't intervene because she suspected something about James Sheets, something in her feelings. She took the validation training, and in particular, the ability that Naomi teaches to center yourself before you try to talk to somebody with dementia. If you're a caregiver, if they sense that you're agitated, they will withdraw. So you have to center yourself. And what she was able to do is use that technique to talk down a gunman at a convenience store where she was working part-time. That's what she did with the validation training. What I learned from the two of them is to empathize with others, you have to slow down and get centered. And in the case of Laurie, if you feel you have a destiny that you've been avoiding, I guess Paul Mackin would agree, stop avoiding it. As I run out of time, I have to mention Mary Gordon. And her story of creating Roots of Empathy is well known. The thing I learned from her was in her upbringing, when she was doing good works as a little girl accompanying her father and her mother in different ways, what she learned from them is, I am no different from they. We are one degree of separation by fortune or whatever you want to call it. I could be them and they could be me. And that is the hallmark of empathy. I promised I was going to give you my results. Here's my functional MRI. Neuroscientists are going to love this. The rest of you, like me, are clueless. This set of images result from the contrast between pain and no pain images. and it is statistically significant. The reference mark is located in the anterior cingulate cortex. There's also a second blob of interest in the thalamus that you can see in the upper left square. I'm going to tell you what it means. It means I have an underactive empathy center. And it turns out I'm like a lot of health professionals who underestimate the pain of our patients for a whole bunch of reasons, some of which may be cultural, some of which may be experience, but I'm one of them. I told you that I had my PPI, Psychopathic Personality Index. Good news, I'm in the 15th percentile for cold-heartedness, and as Derek Mitchell said to me, people like that are cuddly. On the other hand, I'm at the 86th percentile for Machiavellian egocentricity, and the 86th percentile for social influence, and the 71st percentile for nonconformity, which I think you already know. As Derek said, it means I'm good at getting people to do what I want them to do. I felt many things. He was surprised that I was not surprised. What I was ashamed. And so what were the lessons from the cuddly Machiavellian? Well, there is guilt, which is the negative affective response to your own actions, your circumstances or intentions. I did bad. It's restorative. It's reparative. Tell me what I did wrong. I want to make it better. Then there's shame, which is the intensely painful feeling that we're unworthy of love and belonging. I am bad. You know, I wish that the earth could open up a big hole and swallow me up. That's what Brené Brown says. It takes secrecy and silence and judgment to grow shame. It's associated with depression and anxiety. The prevalence among healthcare workers is unknown, but I suspect that it's high. What's the link? Why am I talking about empathy? Because imagine now what it's like to be the other person. That's cognitive empathy, but now you're ashamed of yourself. So now I have to imagine what that family was thinking of me when the husband wrote the letter and said, is there still a kind human being underneath? I've discovered the antidote to my shame and my path to empathy. It began with me talking about my medical mistakes openly and being a beacon for those who felt ashamed of their mistakes, to say, you are not alone, I have done it, and maybe I've done worse. I'm going to close out with my lessons, some of the things that I've talked about today. If you've had emotional deprivation, use it to help others in similar circumstances. If you've been lonely, as Naomi Feil was, embrace it to know how others who are lonely feel. Embrace your mistakes and your failings and use them to empathize with those who are where you have been. Even if you've done something terrible, at the very least, if others have done something that terrible, you can be a beacon to them. Share openly what you're ashamed of. Shame cannot flourish in the open. Be mindful, as Shalla did, and try to live in the moment. You can always find at least one thing in common with everyone on the planet. Mary would certainly tell you that. And if you have pain and disappointment, your gift of empathy is in your pain and disappointment. So, as we go through the rest of this wonderful conference today, center yourself, smile, greet everybody, acknowledge and greet families, as I now do in the emergency department. Sit down. Everything is going too fast. This is what I do in the emergency department. Sit down and slow down, communicate clearly, and imagine that you're the one who has to receive the information that you're trying to communicate. Try a little humor. Be human. Admit that you've made mistakes. And as was said in that wonderful movie, Wonder, if you have a choice between being kind and being right, choose kind. Thank you.